The savory aroma of crispy fried chicken and freshly baked biscuits filled the air, blending with the hum of conversation and the occasional giggle of children sipping their sodas. At a quiet corner table near the window sat Barron Trump, dressed simply in a hoodie and jeans. He wasn't seeking attention, just a brief moment of peace as he turned the pages of a well-worn book. His tall frame hunched slightly over the table. He looked like any other young man searching for a moment of calm amid the chaos of daily life. Suddenly, the warm ambiance of the restaurant was shattered by a loud, harsh voice. "Do you think you're better than the rest of us?" All heads turned toward the commotion. A man in his 40s, his face weathered and his tone angry, pointing directly at Barron. The sharpness of his voice cut through the air like a blade, leaving a tense silence in its wake. The man's worn jacket and scuffed shoes added to his aura of hardship. He stormed toward Barron's table, his anger burning fiercely in his eyes. With a mix of bitterness and frustration, he barked, "Look at you, sitting there so relaxed, reading a book like you haven't a care in the world. Do you even know what it's like to struggle? To lose everything?" Barron looked up from his book, his expression calm but attentive. The restaurant seemed to freeze. Every diner paused mid-bite, their eyes glued to the unfolding scene. Behind the counter, a young employee glanced at a nearby phone, weighing whether she should call for help. But Barron didn't flinch. Slowly, he closed his book and placed it on the table, moving with a measured composure that contrasted starkly with the man's fiery outburst. In a steady, confident voice, Barron replied, "I'm not sure what's upset you, sir, but maybe we can talk about it." The unexpected calmness in Barron's response caught the man, and everyone in the restaurant, off guard. The man hesitated, his brow furrowing as the storm of anger in his eyes met Barron's unflappable demeanor. He didn't answer immediately, but stared at Barron, a mix of surprise and internal conflict flickering across his face. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with curiosity and unease. Every eye was fixed on the interaction, wondering what would happen next. Would the man's fury escalate? Or could Barron's calm resolve diffuse the situation? The man stepped back, his shoulders tense. Barron's invitation to talk seemed to stir his frustration even more. With a sneer, he spat, "Talk? You think I need to talk to some kid who has no idea what real life is like? You live in luxury, everything handed to you on a silver platter. You don't know what it means to struggle, to lose." His words, laced with both anger and pain, hung in the air. The room grew heavier with each syllable. Customers exchanged uneasy glances, and a mother at a nearby table pulled her child closer, as if shielding them from the intensity of the moment. Yet Barron remained composed. Tilting his head slightly, he looked at the man, not with defiance, but with genuine attentiveness. His voice, calm and sincere, broke the tension. "I don't know what you've been through, and you're right. I can't fully understand. But if you're willing to share, I'd like to listen." Barron's words, though simple, carried a humility that startled the man. For a moment, the anger in his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. No one had ever told him that his story deserved to be heard, at least not with such sincerity. But the weight of his anger still clung to him, like a heavy burden he couldn't easily let go. Crossing his arms, his gaze sharp as a blade, he challenged, "You think hearing my story will make you feel better about yourself? Do you even deserve to hear it?" A tense silence enveloped the restaurant. It felt as though even the breaths of those present had become cautious, muffled by the gravity of the moment. Behind the counter, the young employee exchanged glances with her colleagues, unsure whether to intervene or let the scene play out. Barron, still seated, met the man's glare head-on. With unwavering resolve, he replied, his voice steady yet full of conviction. "I don't think this is about me feeling better. I think your story matters because we all have something to learn from each other." His words were like a gentle breeze over a raging fire, softening the man's fury just enough to make him pause. The man stared at Barron, the storm in his eyes beginning to give way to a mixture of doubt and reluctant introspection. The atmosphere in the restaurant hung in a delicate balance, teetering between escalation and resolution. Every diner watched with bated breath, sensing that what came next could change the course of not just this conversation, but perhaps something greater. Would the man be willing to open up? And if he did, what kind of pain would his story carry? Everyone in the KFC sat in silent anticipation, their eyes glued to the unfolding scene, waiting for what would happen next. The man stood frozen for a moment, his hands clenching and unclenching as if wrestling with an invisible weight. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, caught in the gravity of his decision. Finally, with a heavy sigh that felt like it carried the burden of his world, the man pulled out a chair and sat down, his movements slow and deliberate, as though each motion bore the weight of his struggles. He didn't look directly at Barron. His gaze wandered across the table, as though searching for something stable to anchor his swirling emotions. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer booming or harsh. Instead, it was raspy, worn out, tired. "You wouldn't understand," he began, shaking his head slightly. "I've worked hard all my life. I used to have a good job at a factory. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I had a family, a wife, 2 little kids. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and I thought that was all I needed." The man paused, inhaling deeply as if trying to gather whatever strength he had left. Barron remained silent, his calm, attentive gaze encouraging the man to continue without a word of interruption. "And then the factory closed," the man said, his voice breaking slightly. "Just like that. Overnight, everything I worked for was gone. I lost my job. We lost our house. I tried to hold us together, taking whatever work I could find. But it wasn't enough. It never was. My wife..." He hesitated, his voice trembling. "She left. She said she couldn't live like this anymore. She took the kids with her. And honestly, I can't blame her. How could I?" His words hung in the air like heavy bells, resonating through the silent restaurant. A few diners lowered their gazes, hiding the glimmer of emotion welling in their eyes. A woman at a nearby table gently rested her hand on her grandchild's shoulder, seeking comfort in the moment. The man stared down at the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood absently, as if grounding himself. "I've got nothing left," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Now, every room I walk into, I feel like everyone's looking at me, judging me, thinking I'm nothing. That's my life now. Every single day." Finally, he raised his eyes to meet Barron's. They were glistening with unshed tears, but behind them was also a flicker of bitterness, a question that demanded an answer. "And then I see you, sitting here, reading your book, eating your chicken like you've got no worries in the world. And I can't help but ask myself, how can your life be so easy while mine is so hard?" The restaurant fell into an almost eerie silence. You could hear the faint sizzling of oil from the kitchen, but beyond that, there was nothing. The man's words pierced the air like shards, cutting through the hearts of everyone who listened. Barron, still calm and steady, lowered his gaze briefly before looking back at the man. His voice, soft but filled with a deep empathy, broke the silence. "You're right. I can't truly understand what you've been through. But I do know what it feels like to be judged. To feel like people look at you and don't really see who you are." His words, spoken with such sincerity, seemed to cool the storm raging inside the man. He didn't respond immediately, but the tension in his posture began to ease. For the first time, his gaze softened, as though he were seeing Barron in a different light, perhaps for the first time. And the restaurant seemed to shift too. The air grew lighter, filled with a quiet thoughtfulness as though everyone present was reflecting on the weight of the exchange they had just witnessed. The man, his hands resting loosely on the table, glanced at Barron with a mix of skepticism and newfound curiosity. "You're telling me you know what it feels like to be judged?" he asked, his tone less sharp but still tinged with doubt. You, with everything handed to you, how could you possibly know? Barron drew in a slow breath, meeting the man's gaze with unwavering calm. You're right, he admitted. I've never had to worry about food or a roof over my head. But that doesn't mean my life has been free from pressure or pain. Sitting up straighter, Barron leaned in slightly, his tone taking on a quiet intensity. Ever since I was a kid, people have looked at me through the lens of my name, through my parents and the life they think I live. They decide who I am before I even have the chance to figure it out for myself. His words hit a nerve, resonating with a part of the man that had long been buried beneath his own pain. The man furrowed his brow, not out of anger, but because of a quiet, unfamiliar understanding starting to seep in. Barron continued, his voice steady and thoughtful. I'm not comparing my struggles to yours because they're different. But I know this much. We all carry burdens that others can't see. Maybe, instead of judging each other, we could start by listening. The final words landed like a gentle ripple, spreading through the room. A woman near the counter clutched her chest, her eyes misty as she took in the conversation. Behind the register, a young worker froze mid-task, his gaze lost in thought. The man leaned back in his chair, his rigid posture finally softening. Folding his hands in front of him, he bowed his head slightly, his voice now subdued. Maybe I was wrong. Wrong to think you were just some spoiled kid who couldn't understand. You're not what I thought you were. For the first time, his eyes met Barron's without hostility, without walls. It was a moment of realization, not just for the man, but for everyone who had been silently watching. Barron's response was a gentle smile, one that wasn't meant to gloat, but to reassure. Thank you for sharing your story, he said simply. I think we all have something to learn from each other, no matter where we come from. The weight of Barron's words echoed throughout the restaurant. It wasn't just a message for the man sitting across from him. It was a message for everyone present. The atmosphere grew warmer, softer, as if the shared humanity of the moment had brought everyone closer together. The man stared at Barron for a moment longer, as though trying to fully grasp what had just unfolded. And in his silence, there was no longer anger, just the quiet reflection of someone beginning to understand. It was a feeling he likely never thought he could find on what had started as just another ordinary day. The man sat silently, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. Barron's words seemed to linger in his mind, breaking through the wall of anger he had built over years of isolation and pain. The world around him felt blurred and distant, leaving only the heavy thoughts weighing on him. After a long pause, he drew a deep breath and lifted his head. His eyes, though still clouded with sadness, now carried a gentler light. I think you're right, he admitted, his voice low and reflective, each word laden with the weight of a pain long buried. I've been holding on to this anger for too long, and today, I took it out on you. Someone who doesn't deserve it. He paused, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, as if trying to preserve the last fragments of his pride. I'm sorry, he said, his voice trembling. The apology, simple as it was, carried the gravity of a heart weary from carrying its scars for far too long. Barron looked at him with eyes full of understanding. He smiled, not a smile of triumph, but one that radiated warmth and appreciation for the courage it took to admit such a truth. Thank you, Barron replied, his voice calm and genuine. Thank you for sharing your story with me. I know that wasn't easy. The man remained silent for a moment, his eyes glistening with emotion. Then, as if driven by instinct, he extended his hand. It was a small gesture, his hand still trembling slightly, but it held immense significance. You're a good kid, he said, his voice now softened with sincerity. Barron reached out and clasped the man's hand firmly, his tone respectful and full of admiration. And you're a strong man. he replied. This unexpected moment of reconciliation shifted the atmosphere in the restaurant. Nearby diners, who had tried to maintain an air of normalcy, couldn't hide their reactions. A woman nodded subtly, as if in agreement. A young boy sitting with his parents stared at Barron and the man, his innocent eyes wide with curiosity about kindness and forgiveness. The man let go of Barron's hand. His shoulders no longer weighed down with the burden they had carried. He gave a small nod and stood, adjusting his jacket as if trying to compose himself. I think I've bothered everyone here long enough, he said, glancing around the restaurant. Thank you, kid, and thank you all for your patience. For a moment, the room was enveloped in a quiet stillness before a slow, deliberate round of applause broke out from a corner of the room. It wasn't loud or ostentatious, but it was heartfelt. Other diners joined in, their claps light yet meaningful, filling the space with warmth that replaced the tension from earlier. The man scanned the room, his eyes glimmering with gratitude. Before he reached the door, he turned back, his gaze locking onto Barron one last time. You've given me something I didn't think I could feel again, he said, his voice soft but resolute. Hope. Thank you. Barron offered a gentle nod, his smile a quiet acknowledgement of the man's words. He didn't need to say anything more. His expression spoke volumes. As the door to the KFC closed behind the man, the restaurant seemed to exhale collectively. Conversations gradually resumed, but they carried a different tone, softer, kinder. Small gestures of goodwill appeared here and there. A customer held the door open for another. Someone else offered a friendly nod, and a little girl shared her fries with her sibling. Barron, still seated at his corner table, reopened his book. Yet, his eyes occasionally drifted to the window, where he knew the man had left with a lighter heart and a renewed sense of hope. This wasn't just a story about an apology. It was about connection, understanding, and the ripple effect of kindness. The kind of moment that lingers in the hearts of those who witness it. From time to time, they drifted toward the window, where he knew a man had just walked away with a lighter heart and a spark of hope newly ignited. As the door of the KFC closed behind the man, the atmosphere inside the restaurant shifted entirely. The usual buzz of activity and chatter was replaced by a thoughtful, emotional quiet. People continued eating, but there was a noticeable change in their expressions. Softer, warmer, and more understanding. A young boy sitting with his family turned to his mother and asked innocently, "Mom, why was that man crying?" The simple question brought a gentle smile to her face. She looked toward Barron, her eyes silently thanking him for creating such a meaningful moment for everyone. At the next table, an elderly woman with a kind demeanor stood up and walked toward Barron. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her eyes glistening with both admiration and emotion. When she reached him, she offered a soft, heartfelt smile. "Young man," she began, her voice warm and steady. "I just want to tell you that what you did today was remarkable. You didn't just help a man release his anger. You reminded all of us that sometimes simply listening is enough to change someone's entire day." Barron looked up at her, his gaze sincere and humble. "Thank you, Mom," he replied gently. "But I think we all can do that. It just takes a little time to try and understand each other." The woman nodded slowly, her smile lingering as she returned to her seat. Yet, her words and Barron's actions had sparked something in the restaurant. A young man in line to order glanced at the person behind him and, without hesitation, gestured for them to go ahead, offering a kind smile. A girl nearby, noticing a child drop their drink, bent down to help without a second thought. No one said anything, but there was an unspoken understanding that kindness had quietly been awakened in everyone there. Behind the counter, the young employee who had earlier considered calling security now wore a small, contented smile. She leaned toward her coworker and whispered, "That kid, he's something special. Who would have thought that something like this could end so peacefully?" At his corner table, Barron took a small sip of water, his eyes once again drifting to the window. Outside, the bustling streets of Philadelphia carried on as usual. But for Barron, the world felt a little quieter, a little more thoughtful. The man's words lingered in his mind. "I've held on to this anger for too long." Barron smiled faintly, not out of pride, but from a deep sense of warmth, knowing he had done something meaningful. He hadn't just helped a man find relief. He had also reminded himself and everyone around him that kindness doesn't have to be grand. Sometimes it's as simple as listening and understanding. As Barron stood up to leave, a staff member approached him with a bright smile. "Thank you," the employee said, his voice filled with admiration. Not everyone could stay so calm, especially after being treated unfairly. Barron nodded, his response quiet but genuine. "Thank you. But sometimes staying calm is all we need to truly understand each other." Stepping out of the KFC, Barron felt the cool breeze brush against his face. He pulled up his hoodie and walked slowly down the crowded street. Yet, he knew that what had just happened inside the restaurant would stay with those people for a long time. A quiet reminder of the power of kindness and empathy. And behind the glass door, a small boy pressed his hands against the window, watching Barron's figure disappear into the crowd. Turning to his mother, he asked with wonder in his voice, "Mom, can I grow up to be like him?" The mother smiled softly, placing a hand on her son's head. "Of course you can, sweetheart. We all can." His wide eyes followed Barron's figure disappearing into the busy street, filled with admiration. "Mom," he asked softly, "can I grow up to be like him?" The mother smiled gently, resting her hand on her son's head. "Of course you can, sweetheart. We all can." As Barron walked through the crowded streets of Philadelphia, his heart was filled with a quiet sense of peace. The conversation at KFC hadn't just helped the man release a heavy burden. It had reminded Barron of something even deeper. Everyone carries stories that remain unseen by others. In that moment, he thought to himself, maybe small acts, like listening or showing empathy, can soothe even the heaviest of pains. And sometimes, those small acts ripple further than we realize. The KFC behind him was no longer just a place where a confrontation had unfolded. It had become a space of inspiration. It was now a reminder that, with understanding, people could see each other differently, less judgmentally, and with more compassion. Today's story wasn't just about Barron or the man he had encountered. It was about all of us. In life, we each carry unseen struggles, burdens that weigh us down in ways others might never notice. But sometimes, all it takes is a little listening, a little understanding, to change someone's day, or even their life. If this story touched your heart, take a moment today to truly listen to someone. A kind word, a small gesture, or even a simple smile can make all the difference. And don't forget, if you love inspiring stories like this one, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can spread kindness to even more people. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again in the next story.